The city of Rivergate never truly slept. Even in the dead of night, its streets hummed with life, some of it lawful, much of it far from it. Rain slicked the pavement, collecting in pools beneath the flickering neon signs that buzzed over half-abandoned storefronts. The scent of wet concrete mixed with the ever-present aroma of gasoline and street food. Rivergate had a pulse one that beat to the rhythm of crime and justice. And tonight Sergeant Jake Ryland was right in the middle of it. Jake shifted his weight, adjusting the tactical vest strapped tight against his chest. His K9 partner Shadow sat alert at his side, ears perked, dark eyes, scanning the shadows ahead. The German Shepherd was as much a soldier as any officer on the force, trained for precision, fearless in action, bound to Jake by a loyalty that went far beyond simple commands. The mission was clear, a raid on the abandoned warehouse along the Rivergate harbor where a notorious gang had been laying low for months. These criminals weren't petty thieves. They were armed, dangerous, and responsible for a string of violent robberies that had left multiple officers injured. Their latest hit had been particularly brutal, and tonight was supposed to be the night the force took them down. Jake's radio crackled in his ear. Sergeant Ryland suspects confirmed inside. Backup is 10 minutes out. The voice belonged to Officer Eli Morgan, stationed half a mile away. Jake pressed the call button. Understood. Holding position, he exhaled sharply, trying to push away the irritation that gnawed at the back of his mind. Backup was taking longer than expected. 10 minutes could be a lifetime in a situation like this. Every second that passed was another chance for the suspects to slip away or for the situation to spiral out of control. Shadow let out a low growl. Jake followed his partner's gaze muscles, tensing as he spotted the movement. A silhouette darting between the rusted remains of an old shipping container stacked near the warehouse entrance. Someone was watching. Jake whispered a command, and Shadow went rigid, prepared to act at a moment's notice. Then, the explosion. A deafening blast ripped through the warehouse doors, sending shattered wood and metal fragments flying through the air like deadly projectiles. The shockwave hit Jake square in the chest, throwing him backward onto the rain-soaked pavement. His breath left him in a sharp gasp as pain erupted along his left side, hot and searing. Gunfire followed, rapid, merciless. Jake's instincts fought against the daze, clouding his mind. His first thought wasn't for himself. It was for Shadow. Where was he? Through the haze of ringing ears and the sharp scent of smoke, he saw the streak of black and tan fur moving. Shadow was in action, weaving through the chaos, barking commands that the enemy didn't understand, but should have feared. Jake tried to push himself up, but his limbs were sluggish, his body refusing to cooperate. Blood trickled down his side, soaking into his uniform. He knew injuries had been shot before, had fought through worse, but this felt different. His vision blurred for half a second before sharpening again. Shadow was in the fight alone, but he wasn't backing down. The shepherd lunged at one of the assailants, clamping down hard on an arm, wielding a pistol. A guttural scream tore through the night as the gang member struggled, but Shadow wasn't letting go. Not until the fight was over. More gunshots rang out. Jake reached for his weapon but found it lying a few feet away, just out of reach. His radio crackled. Jake? Jake, what the hell is going on? Backup's coming in hot. Eli's voice was urgent. Jake wanted to respond, wanted to say something, but the weight of the injury bore down on him like a vice. Shadow barked again, his stance protective, his focus unwavering. Jake's vision dimmed. The world swayed. Pain swelled. Then darkness. Rain splattered against the cracked pavement, soaking the worn streets of Rivergate as sirens wailed in the distance. The world pulsed with urgency, but time moved differently for Shadow. In that moment, there was no past and no future, only instinct. Only Jake. He didn't understand the mechanics of wounds or the fragility of human bodies. But he understood one thing. His partner was down, and he had to act. Shadow stood over Jake's motionless form, his sharp, brown eyes darting toward the gunman retreating into the warehouse. The smell of blood and gunpowder mixed with the rain, creating a cocktail of danger that sent his instincts into overdrive. A trained K9 like Shadow wasn't just a fighter, he was a tactician, a protector, and when needed, a savior. He nudged Jake's arm, whining, the deep scars of concern laced in every sound. No response. A growl formed in his throat. This wasn't right. Jake should have moved. He should have grabbed his weapon, signaled, done something. but he didn't. Shadow paced for half a second, assessing. He could stay, defend, guard, but staying meant nothing if Jake didn't get help. With a final glance at his fallen handler, Shadow ran. His powerful limbs propelled him forward through the city streets, dodging slick puddles and scattered debris. His breathing was steady, his heart racing, but he was trained for speed, for endurance, for moments exactly like this. The world blurred as he moved, each footfall pounding against the wet concrete. He wasn't just running, he was calculating. He needed help, and he needed it now. Then he saw them, 2 officers standing outside their patrol car, parked near an alley just a few blocks from the warehouse. Shadow barreled toward them, barking with urgency, his soaked fur clinging to his body. Officer Eli Morgan turned first. His eyes widened as he saw Shadow charging toward him. What the Shadow? The German shepherd leapt, skidding to a stop in front of them, barking with controlled desperation. Officer Morgan exchanged a glance with his partner before his expression tightened. Jake. It wasn't a question. It was an understanding. A knowing. Morgan reached for the radio clipped to his vest. Officer down. Ryland's been hit near the old Rivergate warehouse. I repeat, officer down. Shadow. Barked again, pacing. Every second mattered. Morgan didn't hesitate. He threw open the patrol car door. Get in, boy. Shadow didn't need to be asked twice. With a powerful jump, he landed inside the vehicle, pressing against the seat. His eyes locked forward, watching the city blur past them as they sped toward Jake. The tension in the car was palpable. Morgan's partner, Officer Reed, gripped the steering wheel tightly. How bad do you think it is? He asked. Morgan glanced at Shadow, at the way the dog's body refused to relax, the way his breathing remained heavy. Bad. Shadow let out a small whine, unable to express his urgency in words, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. The tires screeched against the pavement as they pulled up to the scene. The smell of burning metal and blood filled the air. Morgan was out of the car before it even fully stopped. Shadow jumped down his paws, splashing into the puddles as he ran toward Jake. And then Jake moved. Just barely. Just enough to be seen. Shadow let out a sharp bark, pushing against Jake's limp form, nudging him, urging him to hold on. Morgan was beside him in an instant. Jake, stay with me! Blood soaked the ground beneath them. Shadow refused to back away. He stayed right there, his body pressed against Jake's side, refusing to let go. Then the sirens grew louder. Paramedics rushed in. Hands moved quickly. Voices called out orders. Medical bags opened. Morgan tried to pull Shadow back. He refused to move. Jake was his partner, his responsibility. Shadow watched as Jake was lifted onto a stretcher, the world moving in controlled chaos around him. He watched every detail, every movement, as the ambulance doors swung open. Then Morgan knelt beside him. Come on, Shadow. We're going with him. A small hesitation. Then with a final glance toward his partner, Shadow followed. The blaring wail of the ambulance sirens cut through the drenched streets of Rivergate like a knife. Their piercing cries, a relentless reminder that every second slipping away could be Jake's last. Shadow lay motionless beside his partner's stretcher, his deep brown eyes tracking every shift, every movement, every sharp intake of breath from the paramedics working feverishly to keep Jake alive. The K9 had never been inside an ambulance before. The cramped space smelled of antiseptic and adrenaline, of urgency and fear. But he didn't need to understand medical terms or human fragility to know. Jake wasn't okay. Shadow nudged his limp hand with his wet nose. No response. Not yet. Not ever? No, not yet. Morgan sat across from Shadow, gripping the metal railing near Jake's head as the paramedic pressed down hard on the wound. Stay with us, Ryland. The officer's voice was firm, demanding. But underneath it, Shadow could detect something else. Something raw. Fear. Blood soaked through Jake's uniform in uneven patches, spreading like wildfire across the fabric. A tangled mess of wires snaked around his body, hooked to beeping machines that tracked his pulse, his oxygen, his everything. He's losing too much blood, one of the paramedics shouted. Shadow flinched at the words. Losing. Blood. Too much. None of those sounded good. The stretcher rocked violently as the ambulance took a sharp turn, speeding through empty intersections, its flashing lights painting the city in shades of red and white. Morgan's gaze flickered between Jake and Shadow. He's a fighter, the officer muttered. He'll make it. Shadow wanted to believe that. He needed to believe that. The moment the ambulance burst through the hospital's emergency entrance, the world exploded into action. Shouts filled the air. Nurses and doctors rushed forward. Jake's stretcher was yanked out, wheeled at full speed toward the trauma ward. Shadow leapt down from the ambulance, his soaked paws hitting the polished floor with urgency. He refused to stay behind. He would go wherever Jake went. Morgan barely had time to react before the medical team was already moving. A nurse shouted over the commotion. "Gunshot wound. Massive blood loss. He's fading fast." Shadow ran beside the stretcher, his nails clicking against the tile, his panting heavy. Morgan followed, close behind. "He's strong. He can pull through." But Jake didn't look strong. His body was pale, drenched in sweat. His breathing came in shallow gasps as hands worked feverishly to stabilize him. Shadow nudged his arm. Nothing. No response. A surgeon called out, "We're losing him. Get him to surgery, now!" And just like that, the door slammed shut in Shadow's face. Shadow froze. Morgan placed a hand on his shoulder, but Shadow didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Jake was gone. Not gone forever, no, Shadow refused to believe that, but gone somewhere that Shadow couldn't follow. Morgan let out a slow breath, kneeling beside Shadow. "I know, buddy, I know." But did he? Did anyone really understand what it meant to be left behind? A nurse hesitated by the doors, glancing toward the K9. "We don't usually let animals inside," but she looked at Morgan. "This one's different, isn't he?" Morgan swallowed, hard, nodding. "Yeah, he is." The minutes stretched into hours. Shadow didn't move, didn't sleep, didn't eat. He stayed outside the surgery room, his body tense, his ears twitching at every sound beyond those cold, sterile doors. Morgan sat beside him, occasionally sighing, occasionally shifting, but never forcing Shadow to leave. Because he knew Shadow wasn't going anywhere until Jake did. Then, a movement. The doors opened. A doctor stepped out, sweat glistening on his forehead, exhaustion settling into his posture. Shadow stood immediately. Morgan was slower, standing beside him. The doctor exhaled. He made it. Silence. The kind of silence that wasn't empty. The kind of silence that meant something so much bigger than words. Morgan ran a hand over his face. Damn, Shadow didn't need human words to understand. Jake had made it. The fight wasn't over, but he was still here. And as long as Jake was here, so was Shadow. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the quiet hospital room. It was rhythmic and almost soothing, yet each pulse felt like a fragile thread tethering Jake to the living. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows against the walls, emphasizing the sterile emptiness of the space. But within those cold walls, warmth radiated from the unwavering presence of Shadow. The German shepherd lay at the foot of Jake's bed, his head resting lightly on the edge of the mattress, his keen eyes fixed on his handler's pale face. Hours had stretched into eternity since the nurses had allowed Shadow into the room, an unusual exception made only after his relentless insistence to stay by Jake's side. No amount of coaxing gestures or soft words could move the dog from his vigil. Shadow knew his place, and it was here. Officer Eli Morgan sat slumped in the visitor's chair near the window. His eyes were heavy from exhaustion, his uniform wrinkled after a long night of chaos. A forgotten plastic cup of coffee sat cooling on the small table beside him. He glanced at Shadow, letting out a sigh of both admiration and helplessness. "You don't give up, do you, boy?" He muttered, his voice low and filled with an odd mixture of grief and respect. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound, acknowledging Morgan's presence, but his gaze remained unbroken. Jake needed him, and there was nothing in the world, no force, no command, that could convince Shadow to leave now. Morgan leaned back in the chair, resting his head against the cold wall. His thoughts drifted to the events of the night, the blood-stained chaos, the overwhelming fear, as Jake lay lifeless on the rain-soaked ground. He swallowed hard, his chest tightening as the memories surfaced. Jake was more than just a colleague. He was a leader, a friend, a man who inspired loyalty not just from his team, but from his dog. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, a haunting backdrop to the tense quiet in the room. Every beep was a reassurance that Jake was still alive, but it was also a reminder of how close they had come to losing him. A soft knock on the door broke Morgan's thoughts. A nurse entered, carrying a bowl of water and some food. She set them down near the corner of the room, casting a sympathetic glance at Shadow. "We thought he might need something," she said gently, her voice barely above a whisper. Morgan nodded his thanks, but knew the effort was futile. Shadow hadn't touched the food or water since they arrived. His loyalty was absolute, his focus unshakable. The nurse hesitated for a moment, watching the dog with a mix of awe and sadness before slipping quietly out of the room. Morgan looked at Shadow again, shaking his head. "He'd probably tell you to take it easy, you know," he said with a weak smile. "Jake's always been stubborn like that." The words seemed to linger in the air, unacknowledged but understood. Shadow didn't move, didn't blink. His whole world revolved around the man lying in the bed. Time dragged on. The small clock on the wall ticked away the hours, but neither Morgan nor Shadow seemed to notice. The room was a space suspended between hope and uncertainty, a fragile bubble where nothing mattered except the faint rise and fall of Jake's chest. Morgan's mind wandered as the night deepened. He thought about Shadow, about the stories Jake had told over the years. The endless hours of training, the missions they had accomplished together, the bond that had formed between them. Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a protector, a lifeline. Jake stirred. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but Shadow noticed immediately. He lifted his head, his ears perking forward, his body tense. Morgan sat up straight, his tired eyes snapping to Jake's face. "Jake?" he said softly, his voice filled with cautious hope. A weak groan escaped Jake's lips, his head turning slightly against the pillow. His eyes remained closed, but the movement was enough to ignite a spark of relief in the room. Shadow let out a soft whine, his tail wagging gently as he moved closer to the bed. His nose nudged Jake's hand, the touch careful and full of longing. Morgan leaned forward, his heart racing. "Come on, buddy. Stay with us." Jake's fingers twitched, barely brushing against Shadow's nose. It was a small victory, but for Shadow and Morgan it felt monumental. The monitors beeped steadily, their rhythm unchanged, but the tension in the room began to ease. Morgan let out a shaky breath, a smile breaking through his exhaustion. "You're still in there," he murmured. "You're still fighting." Shadow settled back down beside the bed, his tail wagging faintly. He wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. The world came back to Jake in pieces. Sounds, first soft beeps from machines, the occasional murmur of voices, the distant hum of activity from somewhere beyond the room. Then sensations, sharp pain radiating from his side, an ache that throbbed with each shallow breath. Finally light, harsh, sterile, and blinding, forcing him to squint as he tried to open his eyes. He was alive. Somehow. The realization was slow-weighted. Every inch of his body felt heavy, as if gravity had doubled its grip. His throat burned dry and raw, and his attempts to move were met with stiff resistance from limbs that seemed to have forgotten their purpose. Memories filtered in next, fragmented and hazy. The explosion, gunfire, pain, darkness, Shadow. Jake's heart rate quickened, causing a spike on the monitor beside him. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. His eyes managed to focus, landing on the dark shape curled beside his bed. Shadow. The German shepherd lay quietly, his head resting lightly on Jake's leg ears, twitching as he noticed the movement. The dog lifted his head, his dark eyes locking onto Jake's face with an intensity that was equal parts relief and vigilance. Jake's lips curved into the faintest smile. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Hey, boy." Shadow let out a soft whine tail, thumping weakly against the floor as he pressed his nose against Jake's hand. The warmth of Shadow's touch was grounding familiar. Jake struggled to move his fingers, brushing them lightly against the dog's fur. A small victory. The door creaked open, and Officer Eli Morgan stepped in, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His face showed the exhaustion of the past few days, but when he saw Jake's open eyes, a smile broke through. Rylan Morgan said, relief dripping from his voice. "You're awake." Jake tried to respond, but his throat was too dry. Morgan grabbed a pitcher of water from the bedside table and poured it into a small cup, holding it to Jake's lips. "Take it slow," Morgan said as Jake sipped weakly, the cool liquid soothing the rawness in his throat. Jake managed a croaky thanks. Morgan set the cup down and pulled the chair closer to the bed. "You gave us quite the scare, man. Thought we were going to lose you." Jake's gaze drifted back to Shadow, his hand still resting on the dog's head. "Not him." His voice was barely audible. Morgan nodded, his expression softening as he looked at the loyal K9. Yeah, Shadow wasn't about to let that happen. He led us to, you kept you going the whole way. Didn't leave your side for a second. Jake's chest tightened, emotion stirring beneath the layers of pain and fatigue. He wasn't a man who cried easily, but in that moment he felt the weight of gratitude, of love, of connection. Shadow had saved him. He turned his attention back to Morgan, his voice slightly stronger. How bad is it? Morgan hesitated, his smile fading slightly. You took a pretty nasty hit. Lost a lot of blood. The docs say it'll take time, but you'll pull through. Jake nodded faintly, the effort draining him. His hand moved to touch the bandages wrapped around his side. The pain was sharp, but it wasn't unbearable. He was alive. And for now, that was enough. Shadow shifted his tail, wagging gently as he leaned closer to Jake's face. The dog's presence was calming an anchor in the storm of uncertainty. You're a good boy, Jake murmured, his voice tinged with emotion. You didn't give up on me. Morgan leaned back in the chair, watching the exchange with quiet admiration. He wouldn't even let the nurses move him. Stayed right there until you were out of surgery. Jake smiled faintly, his fingers brushing through Shadow's fur. That's my partner. The room fell silent again, the only sounds coming from the beeping monitors and the occasional hum of the machines. Jake's eyelids grew heavy, exhaustion pulling at him, but he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in days. Shadow remained at his side, his loyal watch unwavering. The hospital room was quiet, save for the faint hum of machines and the occasional footsteps echoing in the hallway beyond the door. Jake sat propped up in his bed, the sterile sheets tucked neatly around him. The ache in his side was a constant reminder of the bullet that had torn through his body, leaving him dangling on the edge of death. But the ache in his chest, the one born of guilt and gratitude, was far harder to ignore. Shadow lay at the foot of the bed, his dark eyes never leaving Jake. The German Shepherd's quiet presence was both a comfort and a challenge. Jake couldn't look at him without feeling the weight of what had happened. The lives that had been risked, the blood that had been spilled, all to save him. You don't let up, do you? Jake muttered, his voice rough from days of disuse. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound and his tail thumped faintly against the floor. He didn't move closer, but his gaze softened as if sensing the storm raging within Jake's mind. Jake sighed, running a hand over his face. You should have left me there, he said softly, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. You could have been hurt, or worse. Shadow let out a quiet whine, shifting slightly but staying in place. His eyes seemed to say what words could not, that leaving Jake had never been an option. The door creaked open, and Officer Eli Morgan stepped in, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. His uniform was wrinkled, his face lined with exhaustion, but he managed a smile as he approached the bed. Hey, Morgan said, setting the cup on the table beside Jake. How are you holding up? Jake shrugged, wincing at the pain the movement caused. Alive, I guess. Morgan pulled up a chair, his expression growing serious. You're more than that, Jake. You're here. That's what matters. Jake glanced down at Shadow, his hand resting lightly on the dog's head. Because of him. Because of all of you. Morgan nodded, his eyes flicking to Shadow. Yeah, that dog's a damn hero. I've never seen anything like it. He wouldn't let us rest until you were safe. Jake's throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, his fingers brushing through Shadow's fur. I don't deserve him. Morgan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Don't do that to yourself, Jake. You're a good man, and you've saved plenty of lives in your time. Let us have this one, all right? Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out the window, the city skyline, visible in the distance. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him. Every decision, every risk taken, every life endangered. He knew the job came with sacrifices, but this time it felt different. This time it felt personal. Do they have the guys? Jake asked after a long pause. Morgan hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, we got them. Thanks to Shadow and the backup team, we were able to round them up. They won't be causing trouble anytime soon. Jake exhaled, some of the tension in his shoulders easing. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Shadow nudged his hand gently, his tail wagging faintly. Jake looked down at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the heaviness in his chest. You don't give up, do you? He said softly. You keep fighting, no matter what. Morgan stood, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. Just like you, Jake. You'll get through this. Jake met Morgan's gaze, the gratitude in his eyes unspoken but clear. Thanks, Eli. For everything. Morgan nodded, then glanced at Shadow with a small smile. Keep an eye on him, all right? Shadow barked softly, in response, his tail wagging a little harder. Morgan chuckled and made his way to the door, leaving Jake and Shadow alone once more. The room fell quiet again, the steady beeping of the heart monitor filling the space. Jake rested his head back against the pillow, his hand still on Shadow's head. The guilt lingered, but so did the gratitude, the knowledge that he was still here because of the loyalty and courage of those around him. As he drifted off to sleep, Shadow stayed at his side, his silent presence, a reminder that no matter how dark things got, there was always something worth fighting for. The smell of fresh air hit Jake like a wave as he stepped outside the hospital doors for the first time in weeks. His legs trembled under his weight, the strain of walking, a stark reminder of how far he still had to go. The crutches beneath his arms creaked with each deliberate step, their sturdy frame the only thing keeping him upright. Shadow was there, trotting silently beside him, his gaze focused and steps careful, perfectly attuned to Jake's pace. The leash looped loosely around Jake's wrist was more symbolic than necessary. Shadow didn't need to be led. He knew exactly what his role was, to guide his partner through the uneven terrain of recovery. Jake stopped at the edge of the hospital courtyard, his chest rising and falling in labored breaths. The brief walk from the hospital doors to the bench by the flower beds had felt like a marathon. His body, once strong and agile, was now unrecognizable, and the realization sent a pang of frustration through him. Shadow nudged Jake's leg gently, his tail wagging in quiet encouragement. Jake looked down at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Not as fast as I used to be, huh? His voice was strained but carried a hint of humor. Shadow's ears perked, his tail wagging harder, as if to reassure Jake that speed didn't matter. Perseverance did. Jake eased himself onto the bench, setting his crutches beside him with a weary sigh. He leaned back, letting the sunlight warm his skin. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. He was outside. He was breathing. He was alive. You don't get it, do you? Jake said softly, looking down at Shadow. You make it look so easy just pushing forward no matter what. Shadow tilted his head, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. He rested his chin on Jake's knee, his presence grounding, calming. Jake let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Maybe you're right. One step at a time, huh? The sound of footsteps drew Jake's attention, and he turned to see Officer Eli Morgan approaching with 2 cups of coffee in hand. His uniform was crisp, but his face carried the familiar lines of exhaustion. Jake knew all too well. Thought you could use this, Morgan said, handing Jake one of the cups before sitting on the bench beside him. Jake took the coffee, cradling it in his hands. Thanks. Morgan sipped his own cup, glancing at Shadow with a small smile. He hasn't left your side, has he? Jake shook his head, his gaze softening as he looked down at the loyal shepherd. Nope. Not once. Morgan leaned back, letting out a deep breath. You know most people wouldn't have made it through what you did. You're lucky to have him, and lucky to have that stubborn streak of yours. Jake chuckled weakly, the sound more genuine than he'd expected. Guess we make a good pair. Morgan nodded, his expression growing serious. It's not going to be easy, Jake. Recovery never is. But you've got people who believe in you. Shadow included. Jake stared into his coffee, his thoughts swirling. He knew Morgan was right. The road ahead would be long, grueling, filled with setbacks. But he also knew that giving up wasn't an option. Not for him, and certainly not for Shadow. He looked up, meeting Morgan's gaze. I'll get there, he said, his voice steady despite the doubt that lingered in the back of his mind. One step at a time. Morgan smiled, raising his coffee cup in a silent toast. That's the spirit. As the 2 men sat in comfortable silence, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues across the courtyard. Shadow remained by Jake's side, his unwavering presence a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there was always a way forward. The precinct buzzed with its usual chaotic energy phones ringing off the hook, officers swapping stories over their desks, and the familiar scent of burnt coffee wafting through the air. Jake stood just inside the doorway, gripping the handle of his cane as his eyes scanned the room. It looked the same, yet, to him, it felt different. He wasn't sure if the change was in the precinct or in himself. Shadow was at his side, his tail wagging faintly as he observed the scene. Despite the German Shepherd's calm demeanor, Jake could sense his awareness. Every movement, every sound, the dog's sharp instincts were on high alert as always. Jake adjusted his grip on the cane, taking a measured step forward. Each movement felt deliberate, a constant reminder of the bullet that had nearly claimed his life. He hated the cane. It felt like a glaring symbol of weakness, but he knew better than to push too hard, too fast. The sound of laughter drew his attention, and he turned toward the break room, where a cluster of officers stood chatting and sipping from mismatched mugs. For a brief moment he hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, to face his colleagues, to face their concern, their pity. "Rylan!" a familiar voice called out. Jake turned to see Officer Eli Morgan striding toward him, a broad grin on his face. "Look who decided to finally show up. Thought you were going to make Shadow do all the paperwork from now on." Jake chuckled lightly, though the movement sent a faint twinge through his side. "Don't tempt me," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. Morgan clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder, careful not to jostle him too much. "Good to have you back, man. The place hasn't been the same without you." Jake glanced around the room, his gaze softening as he took in the familiar sights and sounds. "Feels good to be back," he admitted. As the two men talked, more officers began to notice Jake's presence. A ripple of greetings and handshakes followed, each one filled with genuine warmth. Jake could see the concern in their eyes, the unspoken questions lingering behind their smiles. "How are you really doing? Are you ready for this?" Shadow stayed close, his presence steadying Jake in ways words couldn't. The dog seemed to sense the emotional weight of the moment, his gaze shifting between Jake and the other officers, as if to remind everyone that he was watching, that he wouldn't let anything happen to his partner. "All right, break it up," a voice boomed from the back of the room. Lieutenant Grayson emerged from his office, his imposing figure cutting through the crowd. His expression was stern, but his eyes softened as they landed on Jake. "Rylan, good to see you on your feet." Jake straightened slightly, his grip on the cane tightening. "Thanks, Lieutenant. Good to be back." Grayson nodded, his gaze briefly flickering to Shadow. "And you, of course," he added, his tone lighter. "Don't think we've forgotten who really saved your ass." A ripple of laughter passed through the room, and Jake smiled despite himself. He looked down at Shadow, who wagged his tail in response, his eyes bright and alert. The lieutenant gestured toward his office. "Come see me when you've had a minute to settle in. We'll talk about next steps." Jake nodded, watching as Grayson disappeared back into his office. Next steps. The words lingered in his mind, heavy with implication. He wasn't sure what he was ready for, or if he was ready at all. But he knew one thing. He wasn't done yet. Not with Shadow by his side. As the precinct returned to its usual rhythm, Jake found a quiet corner to sit and gather his thoughts. Shadow sat at his feet, his body relaxed, but his eyes always scanning the room. Jake reached down, resting a hand on the dog's head. "We're really doing this, huh?" he said softly. Shadow tilted his head, his tail wagging gently, as if to say, "Always." Jake took a deep breath, letting the noise of the precinct wash over him. It was overwhelming, yes, but it was also a reminder of why he did this, why he fought to come back. The pain, the doubts, the challenges, they were all part of the job, part of the life he had chosen. And as long as Shadow was with him, he knew he could face whatever came next. The squad car hummed softly as it idled near the edge of the Rivergate Industrial District. The faint glow of streetlights illuminated the wet pavement, casting distorted reflections in the puddles below. Jake sat in the passenger seat, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee. It had been months since he'd been in the field, but tonight marked his first official return to duty. He wasn't sure how to feel: nervous, eager, determined. Probably all three. Shadow sat in the back seat, his ears perked and his eyes scanning the surroundings. The German Shepherd had been unusually quiet during the drive, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Jake glanced over his shoulder, meeting Shadow's steady gaze. The dog's presence was grounding a silent promise that they were in this together. Morgan shifted in the driver's seat, breaking the silence. "You sure you're ready for this?" Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. "I have to be." Morgan gave him a look, one that carried both concern and trust. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Jake. Just take it slow, all right? Jake exhaled his breath, misting slightly in the cool air. I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to do my job. Morgan nodded, satisfied with the response. He glanced at Shadow, who wagged his tail faintly as if to affirm Jake's words. Jake adjusted his grip on the handle of his service weapon, a familiar weight resting against his hip. This wasn't just a routine patrol. Intel suggested that one of the gang members responsible for the Rivergate shootout had resurfaced here. If tonight went according to plan, they could finally put an end to that chapter. Morgan clicked his radio. Units in position? A chorus of confirmations echoed back. Jake's pulse picked up, anticipation tightening his muscles. Shadow let out a quiet huff, sensing the shift in energy. The K9 was trained for moments like these. Focus controlled a perfect extension of Jake himself. Morgan glanced at Jake. You lead. Jake took a steadying breath. He pushed open the door and stepped onto the pavement, his boots splashing lightly in the puddles. Shadow followed, falling into perfect step beside him, his posture alert. The warehouse loomed ahead, silent, dark, abandoned to the casual observer. But they knew better. This place had secrets, and tonight they were going to uncover them. Morgan moved ahead, signaling toward the side entrance. Jake's fingers tightened around his weapon as they approached. Shadow stayed close, his gaze flickering between Jake and the doorway. Morgan counted down with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. Jake pushed forward, sweeping into the room with calculated precision. Shadows stretched across the concrete floor, crates stacked high against the walls. The air smelled of oil and dust. Then, movement. Shadow growled low, his body stiffening. Jake's instincts kicked in as his weapon snapped upward. A figure darted between the crates. Morgan shouted, "Freeze!" The suspect bolted. Shadow sprang into action. The K9 moved with controlled precision, his muscles propelling him forward as he cut across the room, eyes locked onto the fleeing target. Jake followed, heart pounding, as he maneuvered through the maze of crates. The suspect tried to dodge left, but Shadow was faster. With a powerful leap, the German Shepherd tackled the man to the ground, his teeth latching onto the suspect's sleeve. Jake caught up, weapon-trained, breath-heavy. Don't move. The suspect winced, his hands frozen in the air. All right. Morgan arrived seconds later, securing the cuffs around the man's wrists. Nice work. Jake looked down at Shadow, pride swelling in his chest. The dog still held onto the suspect's sleeve, his tail wagging slightly in restrained excitement. All right, boy, Jake said. You got him. Shadow released the fabric, his eyes flicking to Jake as if seeking approval. Jake gave him a firm scratch behind the ears, silently thanking him. Morgan hauled the suspect to his feet. Let's wrap this up. Jake took a moment to steady himself, the adrenaline still buzzing through his veins. He'd done it. He was back. And Shadow had been there every step of the way. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the city beyond the window. The glow from a single lamp bathed the room in warm light, casting long shadows across the walls. Jake sat on the edge of his bed, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the handle of his cane. It had been 2 days since his first mission back in the field, and though the adrenaline had worn off, the weight of it lingered. Shadow lay at his feet, his head resting lightly on his paws, his ears flicking with every distant sound, passing cars, the occasional murmur from the hallway. The German Shepherd had barely left his side since they got home. He sensed it, Jake knew. The tension, the doubt. Jake let out a slow breath, leaning forward slightly. His side still ached, a dull reminder of how close he had been to losing everything. What wasn't dull was the uncertainty, the creeping thoughts that questioned whether he was truly ready for this. You think I did all right? Jake muttered, looking down at Shadow. Shadow lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Jake's. He let out a soft huff, shifting closer to rest his chin on Jake's knee. Jake smirked despite himself. Didn't think I'd need a therapist, but I guess you qualify. Shadow's tail wagged lightly, thumping against the floor. Jake exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He thought about the mission, the rush, the tension, the weight of his weapon in his hands. It had felt good, it had felt right, but for the first time it had also felt fragile, like he understood now in a way he hadn't before, just how close everything had come to falling apart. The knock at the door pulled Jake from his thoughts. Morgan's voice filtered through. "You decent?" Jake chuckled. "Depends on what you mean by decent." Morgan pushed the door open, shaking his head. "You know, I think near-death experiences have made you even more of a smartass." Jake leaned back, slightly smirking. "Or maybe I was always like this." Morgan crossed the room, handing Jake a fresh cup of coffee before sinking into the chair across from him. He watched Jake for a moment, studying him carefully. "You holding up all right?" Jake sighed, staring down at the steaming cup in his hands. "I'm adjusting." Morgan nodded, taking a sip from his own cup. "It's normal, you know. Coming back from something like that, hell, most people wouldn't even make it this far." Jake glanced down at Shadow, his fingers brushing through the thick fur behind a dog's ears. "Yeah, wouldn't have made it without him." Morgan's gaze softened. "Yeah, I think we all figured that out pretty quickly." Silence settled between them, comfortable but weighted. Morgan leaned back, stretching his legs out. "The guys were talking after the mission. Said you handled things just like old times." Jake scoffed. "Like old times, huh?" He tapped the cane beside him. "Didn't need this before." Morgan shrugged. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean you aren't still the same guy." Jake exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he let the words sink in. He wanted to believe that. Wanted to feel like the same man who had walked into danger without hesitation. The same man who had never once doubted his ability to come out the other side. But it wasn't that simple. There was fear now. Not debilitating, not overwhelming, but present. A whisper in the back of his mind that reminded him of his own mortality. Shadow nudged his leg, his tail wagging gently. Jake chuckled. "You keeping me grounded, huh?" Morgan grinned. "That's his job." Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, staring out the window at the city skyline. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. There would be setbacks, doubts, days where the pain felt like too much. But as long as Shadow was by his side, as long as he had a reason to keep pushing forward, he knew he could face whatever came next. He set the cup down, glancing at Morgan. One step at a time. Morgan raised his cup in a silent toast. "Damn right." Shadow stretched out beside the bed, his eyes fluttering closed. But Jake knew he wasn't really sleeping. He was listening, watching, always aware. Always by his side. The rehab center smelled of sweat and determination. Jake stood in front of the parallel bars, his hands gripping them tightly as he shifted his weight forward. His muscles burned, his side ached, but none of that mattered. What mattered was progress. Shadow sat a few feet away, watching him with unwavering focus. The German Shepherd's stance was steady, his ears perked. He didn't blink, didn't move, just waited, ready to react when needed. He was Jake's silent motivator, his anchor when frustration threatened to consume him. Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself before shifting forward. His legs trembled beneath him, his balance unsteady. Every step felt like a battle against his own body, a reminder of everything he'd lost, and everything he was fighting to regain. Morgan stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression firm but encouraging. "You've got this, Jake. Just keep going." Jake clenched his jaw, pushing through the pain as he took another step. His foot faltered, his weight shifting too fast, and suddenly his body lurched sideways. Before he could hit the ground, Shadow moved. In a swift motion, the German Shepherd was at Jake's side, pressing against his leg just enough to stabilize him. Jake exhaled sharply, gripping the bars tighter, his pulse hammering in his ears. Morgan stepped forward. "You all right?" Jake swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah." He looked down at Shadow, his fingers brushing against the dog's fur. "Thanks, boy." Shadow's tail wagged faintly, but he didn't move from his position. He stayed right where Jake needed him, where he always had. Jake inhaled deeply, adjusting his grip on the bars. He wasn't done yet. Shadow let out a soft huff, shifting slightly beside him, as if telling him to try again. Jake smirked. "All right?" "One more time." Morgan nodded approvingly, stepping back to give Jake room. Shadow remained in place, steady, waiting. Jake pushed forward, his steps slow but sure. The pain was there, it always would be, but so was progress, so was Shadow. And that was enough. The gym was empty, except for the rhythmic hum of machines and the occasional clatter of weights. Jake stood in front of the heavy bag, his fists taped, his stance firm. The familiar scent of sweat and rubber filled the air, a scent he hadn't realized he missed until now. Shadow sat a few feet away, watching closely, his ears perked in quiet anticipation. The German Shepherd had been with Jake through every painful step of rehab, through every moment of doubt, and now he was here for the final push. Jake exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he positioned himself. He needed this moment. He needed proof that his body could do this, proof that he was still the same fighter, still the same cop. He struck. The impact reverberated through the bag, sending a satisfying shock up his arm. He adjusted, shifting his weight, driving forward with renewed force. One hit, then another, then another. Shadow barked once, his tail wagging as if to say, "Finally." The gym was empty, except for the rhythmic hum of machines and the occasional clatter of weights. Jake stood in front of the heavy bag, his fist taped his stance firm. The familiar scent of sweat and rubber filled the air, a scent he hadn't realized he missed until now. Shadow sat a few feet away, watching. Closely, his ears perked in quiet anticipation. The German Shepherd had been with Jake through every painful step of rehab, through every moment of doubt, and now he was here for the final push. Jake exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he positioned himself. He needed this moment. He needed proof that his body could do this, proof that he was still the same fighter, still the same cop. He struck. The impact reverberated through the bag, sending a satisfying shock up his arm. He adjusted, shifting his weight, driving forward with renewed force. One hit, then another, then another. Shadow barked once, his tail wagging as if to say, "Finally." Morgan leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching with a smirk. "You're back, huh?" Jake breathed hard, sweat dripping from his brow, but the smile on his face was undeniable. "Yeah." Morgan nodded, glancing at Shadow. "Knew you'd get here eventually. Just had to let the dog remind you you're not finished yet." Jake looked down at Shadow, reaching a hand out to scratch behind his ears. "Never was. Just needed a second to remember that." Shadow huffed in response, his tail thumping against the floor. Jake clenched his fists again, rolling his wrists. "All right, let's go for another round." Morgan grinned. "Now you're talking." Shadow stepped forward slightly, eyes bright, stance eager. They were ready. Jake was back. The precinct was alive with energy phones ringing, officers moving between desks, and the occasional burst of laughter echoing through the halls. Jake stood just outside the lieutenant's office, rolling his shoulders as he took in the familiar chaos. It felt good. It felt right. Shadow sat beside him, tail wagging, faintly sensing the significance of the moment. The German Shepherd had been with him through every painful step, every doubt, every fight to reclaim himself, and now they were here, back where they belonged. Morgan approached, a grin spreading across his face. "Never thought I'd say this, but damn, it's actually good to see you back." Jake smirked, adjusting his duty belt. "Missed me that much, huh?" Morgan scoffed, shaking his head. "Nah, missed having someone around to take half the paperwork." Jake chuckled, but before he could reply, the lieutenant's voice rang out. "Rylan." "In my office." Jake exchanged a quick glance with Morgan before stepping forward, Shadow following instinctively. The office was the same, stacked files, the faint smell of coffee, and a wall of commendations. It was home. Grayson sat behind his desk, arms crossed. His gaze was sharp, but there was something behind it, something proud. "You sure you're ready for this?" Jake held his head high. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Grayson nodded once, then slid a folder across the desk. "Then welcome back. Your next assignment starts now." Jake took the folder, flipping it open. A fresh case. A challenge. Exactly what he wanted. Exactly what he fought for. Shadow let out a low huff beside him, nudging his leg. "You ready?" Jake smirked, giving the dog a quick scratch behind the ears. "Yeah, buddy. We're back."